Hi, welcome to clip 2 of this week's lecture on culture, the other massive concept in socio-cultural anthropology. So as with every week, I just want to start by really conveying to you what I take to be really the core idea of the approach to culture in anthropology, or approaches in anthropology that take culture as their main concern. And the core idea is this: human beings are qualitatively different from the rest of nature because they have cultures, i.e. they see the world through the meanings that they attach to it. Okay? So if you recall, in last week's lecture we were discussing the ambition that people like Durkheim or Radcliffe Brown had for establishing social anthropology as equivalent to a natural science. It was a social science because it looked at society, but it would operate in ways that are similar to natural sciences and would aim at similar goals to the natural sciences, namely explaining human phenomena with reference to causal mechanisms that generate them. Well, this week we're looking at quite a different approach, quite a different way of understanding what the game of anthropology might be, and one that crucially compares anthropology not so much with natural science, but rather with the humanities and the arts. And the reason for that is that a focus on culture for this approach is a focus on meaning. Human beings are exceptional because, unlike other animals, they attach meanings to their actions. They attach meanings to their interactions, to the structures in which their social life is conducted, and so on. And the role of the anthropologist, therefore, is to do justice to this role of meaning in human lives and to try and understand it, to interpret it, right? So the focus here is on how human beings interpret the worlds in which they live, and human beings that are anthropologists, if you like, have the role of interpreting people's interpretations, right? So we are interpreters of other people's interpretations of their own lives, right? And in that sense, the activity of anthropology can be imagined as a form of cultural translation, right? So if you think of the work that a translator does, they take a text in one language and render it in another language. Well, metaphorically speaking, that's what anthropologists do. We translate the meanings that people attached to their lives in one context into the meanings that we attach to our lives in our context. We perform a cultural translation in that sense, right? And crucially, to understand the meaning that people attach to their lives, one has to see those meanings in their own context. So the idea of context is really important. Cultures comprise of various meanings that people attach to things as they hang together and make sense in terms of each other, right? I'll give an example in a minute. But the idea of placing things in their own context and understanding the meaning in its own context. So one behavior has one meaning in one society, or one culture, I should say, and quite a different one in a different culture because people attach a different meaning to it and one has to see it in its local context. That also means that one of the things that the culturalist approach in anthropology has in common with approaches focused on society is that here too we see this idea of holism, right? So particular meaningful actions make sense in terms of the whole configuration or conglomeration of meanings that comprise a whole culture. And the role of the anthropologist is to interpret each and every meaning that people attach to things in that culture with reference to all of the other meanings that comprise that culture. So it's a holistic enterprise, and again, there's a methodology of holism involved. Crucially, these cultures, these localized cultures, can differ from one place to another. So people in one culture see the world differently than people in another culture. That's also why sometimes the synonym for culture that is often used is the idea of worldview, and this is always used in the plural. People can have different worldviews. They can have different cultures, indeed. We're talking here of a pluralistic concept of culture, right? And given that that's the way that this approach operates, anthropology or anthropologists who take this culturalist approach to their work gain real excitement by the fact that by adopting the perspective of a different worldview from your own, you can question some of the assumptions that underpin your own way of interpreting the world. So married up with this culturalist approach in anthropology is a tendency to what has come to be known within anthropology as cultural critique. So anthropologists who take a culturalist approach often are interested in the activity of cultural critique, adopting the perspective of different cultures in order to say, hey, you know what you think is a kind of universal, natural way of seeing the world? Well, actually, it turns out that this is not at all universal, it's culturally specific. So you kind of deconstruct, if you like, your own assumptions by showing up their cultural specificity, by adopting a perspective upon them that comes from a different culture. And that's what anthropologists are able to do through this act of cultural translation. If you like, it's a way of rendering the familiar unfamiliar, this form of cultural critique. Now, I regret very much that the little window that shows my face to you often overlaps with the writing on my PowerPoint. Of course, the whole PowerPoint is available on Moodle for you to see in its full glory. But here I'm kind of spoiling the joke a little bit because the legend of this little comic strip thing that I put on this slide is Anarchy in the UK. Some of you who like that kind of punk music will know what that refers to. So I've put here a quote from one of the readings for this week, which is due to the gentleman on the left of the slide, Clifford Geertz, a really famous American cultural anthropologist who wrote this really important essay called Thick Description, as well as that other real anthropological top 10 classic, The Balinese Cockfight. Clifford Geertz's work exemplifies a culturalist approach to anthropology. And I put the quote here because I really think that it goes to the heart of what we're talking about. Man, and excuse the sexist language, it's Geertz's, not mine, it reflects the time in which this was written in the 70s. Man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. A really interesting image. I take culture to be those webs of significance, and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. It is explication I am after, construing social expressions on their surface enigmatical. So the meanings, the significance, the webs of significance that people attach to what they get up to, the way they behave, the way that they interact, which may on the surface appear difficult to understand, ways of behaving, of acting that are unfamiliar and challenging to the anthropologist in any way that one might wish to imagine, will become explicated if we search for their meaning. That's the kind of Geertzian culturalist approach to anthropology. And the example, the reason why I put Barack Obama here winking, is that this is an excellent example, just to drive home the point about meaning and seeing it in context. So if you look at the physiological, I'm doing it now, I don't know if I can be seen. Can you see me winking? I can only do it with my left eye, so you probably can't see it very well because I'm also looking downwards. Can you see me now? Winking? Yeah, okay. So I'm trying to do a Barack Obama. Now, it turns out that Barack Obama's wink in that photograph, I believe, is taken by one of those funny speeches that he gives once a year to some kind of journalists, kind of paid for dinner that the American presidents do, which I'm sure Donald Trump is particularly bad at doing. Barack Obama was very good at doing it. So in that context, he was kind of doing a humorous wink. Now, we don't know that context, you're just looking at that picture, but I just had to give it to you in order to interpret the meaning of that wink and convey to you the idea that that wink was supposed to be humorous. Contrast to that the context of this very lecture here and me winking at you. what am I doing here? I'm not trying to be humorous particularly. I'm trying to give you an example of meaning in action. So in this case, in the context of this lecture, the meaning of my wink is that this is a wink of providing an example, a wink, if you like, of exemplification. Those are two radically different things, to give an example and to make a joke, but they're done through the same form of behavior, a wink. The only way that you can see the difference is if you appreciate that human behavior such as this can only be understood in terms of its meaning, a joke versus an example, and that meaning can only be deciphered in relation to its context. So this is what Clifford Geertz means when he talks about webs of significance that we spin. So just to summarize the core agenda of the culturalist approach, anthropology is an interpretive art. Cultures, and this is a really important metaphor that culturalist approaches often put forward, cultures are better understood as metaphors of, through the metaphor of a text. When you're confronted with a text, I don't know, a novel, a poem, a play, or whatever it is that you might like to read, your task is not to explain it, but rather to interpret it. If I can take a really classical reference, since we're in Britain, or this is a British context, you know, the bard, Shakespeare, the big kind of author that British people kind of idolize quite rightly, sheer genius. If you're reading Hamlet, perhaps a very famous play by Shakespeare, you might, a classic kind of, I did A-level English, so I know this, a classic question that people ask about Hamlet was Hamlet mad? Or was there, as Polonius, I think, put it, one of the characters in the play, method in his madness? Was he pretending to be mad, and actually what he was doing was fully calculated? Now, people have debated this over the years in trying to interpret the meaning of Shakespeare's text. And they've looked at the way that Hamlet behaves in the various scenes and acts of the play, the way he acts horribly towards his girlfriend Ophelia, the way he goes around ranting against his godfather stroke uncle, his mother, and so on. Are these the actions of a madman, or are they the actions of a person who's feigning to be unhinged in order to take revenge, perhaps, and so on? Now, all of these are not explanatory questions, they are interpretive questions. So the agenda of an anthropology that is culturalist is interpretive in that sense. And I've broken this down to a kind of comparison with a kind of approach that we looked at last week when we looked at the kind of scientific aspirations or perhaps pretensions of sociology in the way that Durkheim imagined it, or anthropology in the way that Radcliffe Brown imagined it. And I've made a kind of point-for-point contrast of the agenda of society-oriented anthropology versus an interpretive, culture-oriented humanities, arts style anthropology that we're talking about today. Now, I won't go through each point in turn because I think I've already made a lot of them, but I just wanted to refer back to a crucial distinction that I've been making since the beginning of this course, which is that between universalism and relativism. So the scientific-oriented approach to anthropology that we looked at last week has universalistic pretensions. Anthropologists want to identify underlying causal mechanisms that may generate different forms of behavior in different parts of the world, but are underpinned, or in different parts of a single social group for that matter, but are underpinned by certain regularities that have to do with basic mechanical questions to do with social organization and the way that individuals come together to form different kinds of groups, right? So there's a universalistic underpinning to the kind of social-oriented anthropology that we were discussing last week. By contrast, the culturalist approaches that we're looking at this week are unapologetically relativistic, and we'll see more about that in the next clip where we look at the history of this a little bit. So culturalist approaches tend to be relativistic. They look at meaning in its local context, as one of Clifford Geertz's famous book was called, right? Everything that needs to be looked at holistically in its local environment. environment of meaning, its local context. And these contexts can differ, and therefore human meanings, human cultures are relative to their local context. I've put a reference to my initial diagram from the first week of this course, where I was using those circles, the contrast between cultures that can be different from each other, and nature, that is the level through which similarity is apportioned in anthropological arguments. So the culturalist approach to anthropology really dramatizes these differences between cultures through this concept of seeing the world through different culturally tinted glasses, different worldviews, and I've kind of animated or semi-animated this diagram with this figure. So these differently tinted glasses through which different cultures, here personified in these slightly silly emoticons, look at the world from different perspectives and therefore see it differently, right? We look at the same world through different cultural perspectives and we see different things, right? We project our worldview onto nature differently depending on the cultural meanings that we attach to it. Okay, so that's the kind of core idea of culture in anthropology. In the next clip, as I say, I'll kind of go through some of the history of this idea. So I look forward to seeing you there.